Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome to Mr. Peter Stories. I am your temporary host, James Peter, and I feel truly honored to be reading today's chapter for you. Mr. Peter will be back soon, but until then, I promise to bring you the same passion and love he always shares with you. Before we begin, let's take a moment for a beautiful prayer for our Mr. Peter Stories family. May love, joy, and endless blessings fill your lives. And most importantly, let's also send a special prayer for Mr. Peter's health. May he be strong, healthy, and full of energy to continue bringing us these amazing stories. Did you go to church today, my beautiful family? And did you say a prayer for Mr. Peter's health? If you did, let me know in the comments. Now, tell me, are you satisfied with me as your host? If yes, comment yes below. And of course, are you present? Let me know in the comments. All right, my beautiful family, let's not wait any longer. Let's dive into today's story. The Bracewell Foundation's annual gala glittered with New York's elite, crystal chandeliers casting fractured rainbows across the grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum. Michael Bracewell stood at the center of it all, champagne flute untouched in his hand, nodding mechanically at whatever the senator before him was saying. Though he appeared the perfect picture of the billionaire heir, confident in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo, his chiseled features arranged in practiced interest, his eyes constantly searched the room until they found her. Kismet Kaylani. Even her name defied convention, just as she had defied every obstacle life had placed in her path. Tonight, she moved through the crowd like a revelation in emerald silk, the color a perfect complement to her olive skin. Her dark hair cascaded down her back in glossy waves that caught the light with each graceful turn of her head. She wasn't born to this world of old money and older names, her childhood spent in a cramped apartment above her immigrant parents' bodega in Queens. But she commanded the space with a confidence that came from building her beauty empire from nothing but raw talent and relentless determination. When their eyes met across the room, everything else faded away. Michael abruptly ended his conversation, not caring if it was rude. That was the effect she had on him, making all the social niceties and obligations of his world seem suddenly meaningless. "Excuse me," he murmured to the now frowning politician, already moving toward Kismet, like a man pulled by an invisible thread. He navigated through Manhattan's wealthiest and most powerful, barely registering their attempts to engage him. 3 years ago, such blatant disregard for networking opportunities would have been unthinkable. 3 years ago, before Kismet had walked into that investment meeting and changed everything. "You're staring again," she murmured when he finally reached her, her accent a melodic blend of her Mediterranean heritage, soft enough that only he could hear. "Can you blame me?" Michael's voice was low, intimate despite the hundreds surrounding them. His hand found the small of her back, warm through the thin silk. "You're the only real thing in this room." She laughed, the sound genuine among the practiced social titters around them. "Careful, your family is watching. Your mother looks like she's calculating exactly how many generations of Bracewell legacy I'm dismantling just by standing next to you." Michael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he glanced toward his mother, Eleanor Bracewell, whose aristocratic features were set in a mask of polite disdain. Her gray eyes, the same shade as his own, met his across the room with a warning he chose to ignore. Beside her, his brother Elijah watched them with an intensity that bordered on inappropriate, champagne glass clutched too tightly in his pale hand. 3 years, Michael said, returning his attention to Kismet, where it belonged. 3 years of them waiting for this to end, for me to come to my senses. "And have you?" She raised an eyebrow, the question light but her eyes searching his. "Yes." He smiled, watching confusion flicker across her face. "I've come to my senses enough to know what truly matters." Across the room, Eleanor Bracewell whispered something to her younger son. Elijah's eyes narrowed, his gaze never leaving the couple. The brothers had once been close, before competition and their father's relentless comparisons had driven a wedge between them. Where Michael was all confident charm and easy leadership, Elijah simmered with resentment and calculation, always measuring himself against his brother and finding himself wanting. "Maybe we should mingle separately," Kismet suggested, noticing the attention they were drawing. "The foundation has raised almost 8 million tonight. Your mother should be celebrating, not fretting over us." "Let them fret," Michael said, taking her hand. The simple gesture sent whispers rippling through nearby guests. Public displays of affection were not the Bracewell way. "I have something important to ask you." Kismet's breath caught. "Michael." "Not here," he whispered, leading her toward the terrace doors. "Somewhere without an audience." They slipped through the glass doors, leaving behind the suffocating perfection of the ballroom. The April night embraced them, cool but not cold, the hint of spring in the air, a promise of new beginnings. Manhattan stretched before them, a glittering tapestry of lights and possibility. "You know, most people would consider those 8 million guests quite an audience for whatever grand gesture you're planning," Kismet teased, but her voice trembled slightly. Michael turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. Under the stars, away from the scrutiny of his world, his carefully maintained composure fell away, revealing the vulnerability he showed only to her. "3 years ago, you walked into that investment meeting and told me exactly why my company's approach to women's products was backward and borderline offensive." She smiled at the memory. "You looked so shocked that someone would speak to the great Michael Bracewell that way. Your assistant nearly had a heart attack." "I wasn't shocked. I was captivated." His thumb traced circles on her wrist, feeling her pulse quicken. "You challenged everything I thought I knew, not just about business, but about what I wanted from life. I remember you called me the next day, supposedly to discuss my proposal. Then somehow we ended up talking for 3 hours about everything but business." Her dark eyes softened at the memory. "You told me about your father's impossible expectations, how you'd never felt good enough no matter what you achieved." Michael nodded, the memory of his late father's constant criticism still sharp enough to cut. "You were the first person who didn't see me as a Bracewell first and a person second. You saw past all of it, the name, the money, the power, and just saw me." Inside, through the glass doors, Eleanor Bracewell had noticed their absence. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, Elijah following in her wake like a shadow. Her smile remained fixed in place, but tension radiated from her tall, slender frame. "My family believes the Bracewell name is their greatest achievement," Michael continued, unaware of the approaching storm. "But loving you has been mine. Every day with you makes me want to be worthy of that love." Kismet's eyes glistened in the city lights. "I never asked you to choose between them and me. You never had to. Some choices make themselves." He withdrew a small velvet box from his pocket, the movement sure despite the slight tremor in his hands. Time seemed to slow as he sank to one knee, the gesture both traditional and revolutionary given who they were. Behind the glass doors, Eleanor froze, her face paling as she realized what was happening. Elijah's expression darkened, something cold and calculating entering his eyes as he watched his brother, always first, always favored, about to claim something else he couldn't have. "Kismet Kaylani." Michael's voice broke slightly on her name, emotion overwhelming his usual composure. "Your name means fate, and meeting you was mine. These past 3 years have taught me what it means to truly live, to look forward to each day because you're in it. Will you marry me?" The ring caught the city lights as he opened the box, a stunning emerald surrounded by diamonds, unconventional and perfect for her. Not a traditional diamond solitaire like generations of Bracewell women had worn, but something as unique as their love. Kismet stared at the ring, then at the man before her, the man who had stood by her through vicious society gossip, through his family's thinly veiled contempt, through countless moments when it would have been easier to walk away. The man who had helped her negotiate her first major distribution deal when investors were wary of a woman of color without connections. The man who looked at her like she was a miracle even now, on his knee, offering her everything. "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching, then louder as joy burst through her. "Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, the weight of it unfamiliar but right, and rose to claim her kiss. Their bodies melded together, the passion between them undimmed by 3 years. His hands tangled in her hair, cradling her head as if she were precious beyond measure. The kiss tasted of promise and defiance, of a future they would build together despite any opposition. When they finally pulled apart, breathless and laughing, she saw in his eyes everything she'd ever wanted. Acceptance, partnership, a love that asked for who she was, not who she should be. Through the glass doors, Eleanor had pressed a hand to her throat, her worst fears confirmed. The Bracewell legacy, centuries in the making, would be forever altered by this union. Beside her, Elijah's face had settled into a mask of cold calculation, his mind already racing with possibilities this engagement presented. But on the terrace, wrapped in each other's arms, Kismet and Michael were oblivious to the machinations beginning inside. They swayed slightly under the stars, foreheads pressed together, creating their own world between heartbeats. "I should warn you," Michael murmured against her temple. "They'll make this difficult. Not just my mother and Elijah, but the board, the extended family, the social circles. They'll say I could do better, that you're after the money, that it's too fast." Kismet placed a finger against his lips, silencing his worries. "They've been saying all that for 3 years. Has it changed anything between us?" He shook his head, smiling against her finger. "Not a thing." "Then let them talk. We know the truth." She replaced her finger with her lips in a gentle kiss. "I didn't fall in love with the Bracewell heir. I fell in love with the man who stayed 2 hours after that investment meeting to really understand why my approach to beauty products for women of color mattered. The man who calls his grandmother every Sunday, without fail. The man who still gets nervous before major presentations, even though he pretends not to." Michael drew her closer, overwhelmed by how completely she knew him. "When should we do it?" "The wedding." "Soon," she said firmly. "I'm not giving them time to interfere. 3 months maximum." He laughed, the sound vibrating through her. "That's my Kismet, always decisive." "Always as yours," she whispered against his lips, the words both vow and prophecy. They sealed the promise with another kiss, unaware they were being watched not just by Eleanor and Elijah, but by dozens of guests now clustered at the windows, phones raised to capture the moment the Bracewell heir defied convention. And in the shadows beyond the terrace lights, Elijah slipped away from his mother's side, phone already at his ear. "It's happened," he said, voice too low for anyone to hear. "He's actually proposed. We need to move forward with the plan immediately." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "No, Mother suspects nothing, neither does Michael." His eyes fixed on the embracing couple, hatred crystallizing into resolution. 3 months until the wedding? That gives us plenty of time. In the darkness beyond the terrace, storm clouds gathered over Manhattan, distant thunder echoing the conflict to come. But for this perfect moment, Michael and Kismet stood wrapped in each other's arms, defiant hearts beating as one against the world that sought to separate them. Neither of them could have imagined how brief their happiness would be, or the decade of longing that awaited them both. Chapter 2: The Price of Prejudice. The morning after the proposal, Kismet woke to sunlight streaming through the windows of Michael's penthouse. Her phone erupted with notifications before she could fully savor the moment. "Ignore it," Michael murmured against her shoulder without opening his eyes. But Kismet knew better. She reached for her phone and scrolled through the messages, her expression hardening. "It started," she said quietly. Michael pushed himself up beside her, instantly alert. The screen showed page 6 of the New York Post. "Bracewell heir proposes to beauty mogul, love or leverage." The article insinuated their engagement was a business merger disguised as romance. Among the notifications was an ominous text from his mother. "Family meeting. 2 p.m. Non-negotiable." "We knew this would happen," Kismet said with determination. "We prepared for it." "Not for all of it," Michael admitted. "My mother won't go down without a fight." The Bracewell mansion loomed before Michael like a fortress. He parked deliberately late for his mother's summons. Eleanor Bracewell waited in the library, seated in his late father's chair. Elijah lounged by the fireplace, watching like a hawk. "I see the prodigal son still knows his way home," Eleanor said by way of greeting. "Cut the theatrics, mother." "Why am I here?" Michael remained standing, every inch the executive who commanded boardrooms across 3 continents. "You've put us in an impossible position," she replied, pushing a folder across the desk. "This engagement cannot stand. I'm marrying Kismet. Nothing in that folder changes that fact." "You haven't even looked at our offer," Elijah interjected, moving to stand beside their mother. "Offer?" Michael's laugh was sharp with disbelief. $10 million, Eleanor stated coldly. "A clean break. She signs an NDA, returns the ring, and disappears from your life. The only embarrassment here is your pathetic attempt to control my life," Michael replied quietly. "Kismet doesn't want your money. She made her first million at 25. She's with me despite this family, not because of it." "She's using you for connections, for legitimacy," Elijah began. "Legitimacy?" Michael cut him off. "Her products are in every major department store worldwide. What legitimacy does she need from us?" "Blood," Eleanor said simply. "The Bracewell name stands for something. Centuries of careful marriages, building alliances with the right families." "If you go through with this," Eleanor continued, "there will be consequences." "Is that a threat?" "A reality. The board has concerns about your judgment. Several key investors might reconsider their positions if the company heir appears unstable in his personal choices." "You're actually threatening my position. I've doubled our market share in 3 years." "Perhaps. But can your Kismet's company survive without its major distributors? Many have exclusive arrangements with Bracewell-owned luxury retailers." The implied threat hung in the air. Michael felt fear for the first time, not for himself, but for Kismet. "You would destroy an innocent woman's business because she dared to love your son. It would never be traced back to us," Elijah said smoothly. "These things happen in business." Michael looked between them, the mother more concerned with appearances than affection, and the brother who had spent a lifetime in his shadow. "This meeting is over. And mother? If you move against Kismet or her company, I'll sell every share of Bracewell stock I own and fund her expansion personally." Eleanor's composure cracked. "You would choose her over your own family, over your birthright?" Michael met her gaze steadily, without hesitation. The door closed behind him with quiet finality. "He called our bluff," Elijah said, pouring himself a drink. "Did he?" Eleanor turned to the window. "We've only just begun to fight. Contact Mr. Hargrove at the Times. It's time for a different approach." The smear campaign began subtly. First came insider exposés about Kismet's company, unfounded allegations of labor violations, whispers about unpaid taxes, suggestions of harmful ingredients. Though each accusation was disproven, the constant drumbeat of negative press affected her stock price. Then came the personal attacks. Tabloids published photos of Kismet from college, dancing at clubs, quoted anonymous friends who painted her as a calculated social climber. Former employees were paid to tell stories of her supposedly tyrannical management style. Michael stood firmly beside her, his public support unwavering. But the strain showed in the new lines around his eyes and his growing isolation from business associates. 6 weeks after their engagement, they sat in the office of the third wedding venue to cancel on them, listening to another apologetic manager explain about scheduling conflicts. "Just say it," Kismet interrupted. "Someone from the Bracewell family threatened to pull donations or connections." The manager's uncomfortable silence was confirmation enough. Outside, Kismet removed her sunglasses, revealing her exhaustion. "Maybe we should just elope. Number they win if we hide. We'll have the wedding we want, with everyone watching." "What wedding?" "We have no venue, half the guests are declining, and 3 different caterers have become unavailable." He pulled her close, oblivious to passers-by who recognized them. "We'll find another venue. We'll replace every guest too cowardly to stand with us. This wedding is happening." Neither noticed the black sedan parked across the street or the telephoto lens capturing their embrace. The final venue was secured through one of Kismet's clients whose daughter's severe acne had been transformed by Kismet's skincare line. The woman owned a property in the Hudson Valley and offered it unhesitatingly. "My daughter stopped hiding because of you," she told Kismet. "I won't let anyone stop your happiness." With the ceremony location settled, Kismet focused on remaining details. The guest list had been painfully revised, removing those who had declined with transparent excuses. 3 weeks before the wedding, her assistant interrupted with disturbing news. The designer, one of the most exclusive in New York, had canceled their contract, claiming production issues. When Kismet demanded an explanation, the designer was apologetic but firm. "I can't afford to lose certain clients, Ms. Kailani." That night, she finally broke down, sobbing in Michael's arms. "I can't fight them anymore. Every time we solve one problem, they create 3 more. Michael held her, anger a cold knot in his chest. "This ends now," he said, reaching for his phone. "Mother, I'm coming to see you. Tonight. Alone." Kismet grabbed his arm. "No, Michael." He covered the phone. "Trust me," he whispered. The 3 Bracewells faced each other in the library. Michael didn't wait for accusations or offers. "I've drawn up paperwork to formally change my name after the wedding," he announced without preamble. "I'll be taking Kismet's surname. The Bracewell name ends with me." Eleanor's face drained of color. "You can't be serious." "I'm also resigning from all family business interests. My shares will be placed in a trust that will vote against any board initiative either of you supports." Elijah surged to his feet. "You're destroying everything our family has built over generations because we don't approve of your gold-digging girlfriend." Michael's movement was swift. Elijah found himself pinned against the bookcase, his brother's forearm across his throat. "Say that again," Michael whispered. "Give me a reason." "Michael," Eleanor's sharp voice cut through the tension. "Release your brother at once." Michael stepped back, straightening his suit with deliberate calm. "That's the only warning either of you gets. The attacks on Kismet end now. The wedding happens without interference. Or I burn the Bracewell legacy to the ground." Eleanor stared at her firstborn, seeing for the first time a man who had found something worth fighting for beyond the family name. "You would really go that far?" "I already have. The paperwork is filed. The resignation letter is dated." All that remains is whether I make it public before or after the wedding." A heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. "What do you want?" Eleanor finally asked, defeat evident. "A truce, not approval. I don't expect miracles, but the attacks stop. You attend the wedding and show a united family front. Afterward, you treat Kismet with the respect she deserves as my wife." "And if we agree?" Elijah asked, rubbing his throat. "Then I remain Michael Bracewell. I maintain my position in the company. The trust remains dormant unless the agreement is broken." Eleanor and Elijah exchanged a long look. "Very well," Eleanor said finally. "A truce. I want it in writing. And know this, if either of you ever moves against Kismet again, what I've threatened here will seem merciful." He left without waiting for a reply. In the car, he exhaled shakily, the adrenaline leaving him drained. He had just gambled everything, his name, his position, his inheritance, on the hope that his family valued their legacy more than their prejudice. His phone chimed with a text from Kismet. "Are you okay?" For the first time in weeks, he smiled as he replied, "Better than okay. I'm free." The ceasefire held. Eleanor made a public statement expressing the family's delight at the upcoming union. Venues and vendors became available again. The designer miraculously found room in their schedule for Kismet's gown. 3 days before the wedding, Kismet and Michael hosted a small dinner for their closest friends and supportive family members. Eleanor and Elijah were absent, citing a prior commitment, but promising to attend the rehearsal dinner. As they stood on the restaurant balcony watching the sunset paint Manhattan in gold, Kismet leaned into Michael's embrace. "We did it," she murmured, "against all odds." Never doubted it for a second. Inside, their friends called for a toast. Michael reluctantly released her. "I have to leave for Chicago in the morning for that final contract signing, but I'll be back tomorrow afternoon for the rehearsal." "I wish you didn't have to go." 6 hours, tops. I'll take the jet and be back before you miss me." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "What are you doing tomorrow?" "Final dress fitting, then meeting the florist. Nothing I can't handle." He sealed his promise with a kiss. Neither could have known it was the last promise he would make to her, or that the hard-won truce with his family was about to shatter in ways that would echo through the next decade of their lives. As they rejoined their celebration, Elijah sat in a darkened office across town, finalizing arrangements with a man whose services didn't come cheap. "Everything is in place," the man confirmed. "Tomorrow, as scheduled." "No mistakes," Elijah emphasized. "It has to be perfect. No trace, no trail." "That's why you're paying premium, Mr. Bracewell. Disappearances are our specialty." Elijah ended the call and stared at a photo of Michael and Kismet at their engagement. "Sorry, brother," he whispered, "but the Bracewell legacy was never meant for her." Chapter 3. Vanished. The morning of Michael's Chicago trip dawned with an unexpected heaviness in the air. Kismet woke before the alarm, watching Michael pack his overnight bag with practiced efficiency. "I could still come with you," she offered, drawing the sheet around her bare shoulders. "The dress fitting can wait." Michael smiled, leaning over to kiss her forehead. "And give your designer another reason to hate us?" "I don't think so." He brushed his thumb across her cheek. 24 hours, then we never have to be apart again." She caught his hand, pressing it against her face. "Promise. Cross my heart." His eyes softened as he looked at her. "When I land, I'll call." "I'll be counting the minutes," she replied, trying to shake the inexplicable dread that had settled over her. The last image of Michael she would hold for 10 years was him standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the morning light, blowing her one final kiss before he disappeared. By noon, Kismet had thrown herself into wedding preparations, pushing aside her unease. The final fitting for her dress went perfectly, the ivory silk hugging her curves before cascading to the floor in elegant simplicity. "You'll take his breath away," the designer assured her, apparently having forgotten her earlier reluctance to work with the bride. Kismet smiled, turning to examine the back of the gown in the mirror. That's the plan. It was during her meeting with the florist that the first call came. Michael's assistant, voice tight with controlled panic. "Miss Kaylani, have you heard from Michael today?" "Not since he left for the airport this morning." "Why?" The chill returned, crystallizing into fear as the assistant explained. "His plane never arrived in Chicago. Air traffic control lost contact somewhere over Pennsylvania." The world tilted sideways. Kismet gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. "What are you saying?" "The company jet is missing, Ms. Kaylani. Search and rescue has been mobilized, but..." The woman's voice broke. "I thought you should know." Kismet moved through the next hours in a fog of disbelief. She took a car directly to Bracewell Tower, ignoring the startled looks from employees as she burst into the executive suite. Eleanor Bracewell stood at the window of the crisis room, her back rigid, while Elijah barked orders into a phone. Both turned as Kismet entered. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor's voice was ice. "My fiancé is missing," Kismet replied, equally cold. "Where else would I be?" "This is a family matter," Elijah interjected, hanging up the phone. "We're handling it." "I am family." Kismet held up her left hand, the emerald ring catching the light. "Or have you forgotten?" Eleanor's lips thinned to a bloodless line. "Not yet, you're not." The search lasted 3 agonizing days. Kismet fought for every scrap of information, battling the Bracewell's attempts to exclude her from briefings. She hired her own aviation experts, contacted search teams directly, and refused to leave Bracewell Tower despite Eleanor's increasingly hostile demands. On the 4th day, what should have been their wedding day, debris from the jet was found scattered across a remote section of the Allegheny Mountains. "The impact was catastrophic," the search coordinator explained gently to the assembled group. "The weather conditions, the mountainous terrain, recovery efforts will be difficult." "Recovery?" Kismet's voice sounded distant to her own ears. "I'm sorry, Ms. Kaylani. At this point, we're looking for remains, not survivors." The room spun around her. She felt herself falling, then strong arms catching her, Elijah, of all people, guiding her to a chair. "We need to prepare a statement," Eleanor said, already moving toward practicalities, her grief locked away behind years of practiced composure. "No." Kismet found her voice, steel beneath the shock. "Not yet. Not until we're absolutely certain." "The evidence is conclusive," Elijah said, his hand still on her shoulder in a gesture that seemed supportive but felt like a weight. "My brother is gone." She shrugged off his touch. "Without a body, there's still hope." Eleanor's laugh was brittle. "Hope?" "The jet disintegrated on impact. There's nothing to find." "Then I'll wait forever," Kismet replied, rising to her feet, "until Michael comes home or until I have proof he's truly gone." The days blurred into weeks. The search was called off officially after 14 days, despite Kismet's protests and offers to fund continued efforts. The authorities declared Michael presumed dead, a phrase that cut through her each time it was uttered. The Bracewells held a memorial service, elegant, restrained, and entirely devoid of the vibrant energy that had been Michael's essence. Kismet sat in the front row, isolated in her grief, painfully aware of the whispers behind her. Poor girl. Almost a Bracewell. What happens to her now? Eleanor delivered a eulogy that spoke of legacy and duty, painting her son as the perfect Bracewell heir without once capturing the man Kismet had loved. When it was Kismet's turn to speak, she stood before the gathering of New York's elite, many of whom had declined their wedding invitation, and unfolded the vows she had written for a day that never came. "I promise to love you without condition," she began, voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "To support your dreams as fiercely as my own, to stand beside you against any storm." Her eyes found Eleanor's icy stare. "Those promises don't end because you're not here to hear them. I will love you, Michael Bracewell, until my last breath, and I will never stop looking for you." The gasps and murmurs that rippled through the church only strengthened her resolve. She returned to her seat, ignoring the pitying looks and Eleanor's thinly veiled contempt. After the service, as mourners gathered at the Bracewell mansion, Kismet found herself cornered by Elijah in Julian Bracewell's old library. "You made quite a scene," he said, offering her a glass of whiskey. She ignored the drink. "I spoke my truth, something rare in this house. What exactly are you implying?" His voice hardened. "Nothing." Yet, she met his gaze directly. "But Michael told me about your conversation that night when he threatened to change his name. He wasn't easily frightened, your brother." "Nor are you, apparently." Elijah studied her with new interest. "What will you do now? Continue his work? Honor his memory?" She moved toward the door, then paused. "And keep looking. People don't just vanish, Elijah. Not even Bracewells." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "In this case, I'm afraid one did." 1 month after the memorial, Kismet was in her office reviewing quarterly projections when her assistant burst in without knocking. "Ms. Kaylani, there are police officers here. They say—" The young woman was interrupted as 2 detectives entered behind her, their expressions grim. "Kismet Kaylani?" the female detective asked, though it clearly wasn't a question. "We need you to come with us." "Why?" Kismet rose slowly, instinct warning her something was terribly wrong. "We have some questions regarding the disappearance of Michael Bracewell." The male detective moved closer, his voice dropping. "Ma'am, we have a warrant for your arrest on suspicion of conspiracy and fraud related to Mr. Bracewell's death." "Death?" The word fell like a stone. "There's no proof he's dead, and I had nothing to do with his disappearance." "The evidence suggests otherwise." The detective produced handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent." Kismet barely heard the Miranda rights as the cold metal closed around her wrists. Through the glass walls of her office, she could see her employees watching in horror as she was led away. At the police station, the true nightmare began. They took her jewelry, including Michael's ring, her designer clothes, everything that connected her to her identity. In the harsh fluorescent light of the interrogation room, the detectives laid out their case against her. "An offshore account in your name received $5 million the day before Michael Bracewell's plane disappeared," the female detective said, sliding photographs across the table. "An account opened 3 months ago, right after your engagement." "That's impossible," Kismet whispered, staring at the banking documents. "I never opened this account." "We also have text messages," the male detective continued, "between you and an unidentified contact, discussing how to get out of the relationship without losing your company's connections to Bracewell Industries." Kismet's head snapped up. "Those are fabricated. I never sent those messages. The phone records say otherwise." For 3 days they held her, questioning her repeatedly about her relationship with Michael, about financial difficulties her company had faced before their engagement, about her convenient rise in social standing through their relationship. Her lawyer, the best money could buy, fought tirelessly, pointing out the circumstantial nature of the evidence, the lack of motive given Kismet's own successful business, the absence of a body or any direct link between her and the plane's disappearance. Finally, on the 4th day, she was released. Insufficient evidence to proceed at this time, the prosecutor announced, though the implied "for now" hung in the air. Kismet emerged from detention to find her world transformed. Headlines screamed accusations: "Beauty Queen" or "Black Widow." Paparazzi swarmed as she left the courthouse, shouting questions about whether she had killed her fiancé for his fortune. Her phone rang as she slid into the waiting car. Unknown number. "Ms. Kailani." Eleanor Bracewell's voice was cool and collected. "How unfortunate, these accusations." Kismet's grip tightened on the phone. "You did this. I assure you, the police conduct their investigations independently, though I must say the evidence is compelling. There is no evidence because there was no crime. Michael is missing, not dead, and I had nothing to do with it." Eleanor's sigh was almost theatrical. "Your continued denial is distasteful. Michael is gone. The authorities may not have enough to convict you, but society has already rendered its verdict. Is that why you called? To gloat?" "To advise," Eleanor corrected. "Leave New York. Restart somewhere your reputation doesn't precede you. It's the sensible choice." Kismet laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "I'm not going anywhere, Eleanor. Michael would never abandon what he built, and neither will I. Then you'll face the consequences of your choice. Goodbye, Ms. Kailani." The line went dead, leaving Kismet alone with the realization that her nightmare was only beginning. In the following weeks, she lost major retail contracts as vendors distanced themselves from the scandal. Social invitations dried up. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. The investigation remained officially open, a sword hanging over her head. But through it all, one certainty kept her going. Michael was out there somewhere, and if the Bracewells had orchestrated his disappearance, they had made one critical mistake. They had left her alive to find him. Chapter 4. Accused. 6 months after Michael's disappearance, Kismet sat across from her board of directors, their faces reflecting varying degrees of concern and skepticism. Her once thriving beauty empire was hemorrhaging contracts, stock value, and public goodwill. "The numbers don't lie," her CFO concluded, closing his presentation. "We've lost 30% of our retail partnerships. Our European expansion is effectively dead. If this trend continues..." He didn't need to finish. Everyone knew what bankruptcy looked like. "It's the Bracewell connection," one board member said, voicing what they were all thinking. "As long as these allegations hang over the company, retailers won't touch us." Kismet met each gaze unflinchingly. "I didn't kill Michael. I didn't arrange his disappearance. And I will not step down as CEO of the company I built." "No one's suggesting that," the CFO backpedaled quickly. "But perhaps a temporary leave of absence just until the investigation concludes." "The investigation will never conclude," she cut in. "That's the point. The Bracewells have made sure of it. If I step aside, even temporarily, I'll never get the company back." The tension in the room was palpable as board members exchanged glances. "Then what do you propose?" the chairman finally asked. Kismet opened a folder containing her new strategy. "We pivot, direct-to-consumer sales, cut out the retailers who've abandoned us, launch a campaign centered on resilience and authenticity." Her voice hardened. "If they want to make me the villain, I'll use it. Every woman who's ever been wrongfully accused, who's had to fight twice as hard to be taken seriously, they become our market." The board's skepticism slowly gave way to tentative hope as she outlined her plan. By the end of the meeting, she had their grudging support for a 3-month trial of the new strategy. As the boardroom emptied, her assistant appeared at the door. "Detective Reynolds is here to see you." Kismet's shoulders tightened, but she nodded. "Send her in." Detective Maria Reynolds had been a constant presence in Kismet's life since her arrest. Unlike her partner, Reynolds seemed less convinced of Kismet's guilt, approaching the case with methodical neutrality. "Ms. Kaylani," the detective greeted her, declining the offered seat. "We found something you should know about." Kismet's heart leapt. "Michael?" "No." Reynolds' expression softened momentarily. "I'm sorry. It's about the offshore account that received the $5 million. The one I supposedly opened? I've told you repeatedly." "I know what you've told me," Reynolds interrupted. "What's interesting is that the money was withdrawn 2 days after Mr. Bracewell disappeared. All of it transferred to a different account we haven't been able to trace." Kismet stared at her. "If I'd arranged Michael's disappearance to get that money, why would I transfer it immediately? Why not wait until suspicion died down?" "Exactly the question I've been asking," Reynolds agreed. "It doesn't fit the profile of someone executing a calculated plan." Hope flickered in Kismet's chest. "Does this mean you're looking at other suspects?" "It means the investigation continues in all directions," Reynolds replied carefully, "including the possibility that Mr. Bracewell arranged his own disappearance." The suggestion hit Kismet like a physical blow. Michael would never do that. Never. Reynolds studied her reaction closely. "People aren't always who we think they are, Ms. Kaylani." "Michael is exactly who I know him to be," Kismet insisted. "And he's out there somewhere. I can feel it." The detective's expression remained professionally neutral. "One more thing. We've been trying to access Mr. Bracewell's personal email accounts. His family has been less than cooperative. If you have any passwords—" "I don't," Kismet admitted. "Michael was careful about security. But I do have access to our shared cloud storage. It might have something useful." She wrote down the login information, watching Reynolds pocket it with a nod of thanks. "I'll be in touch if anything develops," the detective promised, moving toward the door. She paused, turning back with an uncharacteristically personal comment. "Ms. Kaylani, watch your back. Not everyone investigating this case is as interested in the truth as I am." The warning lingered in the air long after Reynolds departed. True to Kismet's prediction, the investigation dragged on without resolution. But her business strategy worked better than even she had hoped. Women rallied around her brand, drawn by her refusal to be silenced. Direct sales soared. A social media campaign featuring customers sharing their own stories of resilience went viral. By the one-year anniversary of Michael's disappearance, Kaylani Beauty had not only recovered but transformed into something stronger and more authentic than before. Kismet marked the date privately, arranging a single meeting with Detective Reynolds, who had become her primary contact within the investigation. "The case is going cold," Reynolds admitted over coffee in a quiet corner of a nondescript diner. "The only place Kismet could go without being recognized or photographed. Without new evidence, it'll eventually be classified as an unsolved disappearance. And the accusations against me? The department has stopped actively pursuing that angle," Reynolds confirmed. "But officially, the case remains open." Kismet nodded, having expected nothing more. "And unofficially? What do you think happened to him?" Reynolds hesitated, breaking her usual professional detachment. "Officially, I have no opinion. Unofficially." She leaned forward. "The money trail doesn't lead to you. Someone wanted it to look that way." "The Bracewells," Kismet said with quiet certainty. "I can't comment on that." Reynolds stirred her coffee unnecessarily. "But I can tell you that Elijah Bracewell has taken control of the family business with remarkable speed. The board voted him CEO last month, removing Eleanor to an honorary position." Kismet absorbed this information. Michael always said Elijah resented living in his shadow. "Resentment is a powerful motive," Reynolds agreed. "Unfortunately, suspicion isn't evidence. And the Bracewells have considerable influence with the department." "With everyone," Kismet corrected bitterly. Reynolds checked her watch and stood to leave. "Ms. Kaylani, a word of advice. The public has largely moved on from suspecting you, but the Bracewells haven't. If you're right about their involvement, they won't want you continuing to search for the truth." Kismet remained at the table long after the detective left, turning her engagement ring around her finger, the emerald that had once symbolized their future, now a reminder of unfinished business. That night, she made a decision. If justice wouldn't come through official channels, she would find it herself. 2 years after Michael's disappearance, Kismet had created a new normal for herself. By day, she ran her now thriving company, its feminist messaging and ethical practices drawing a devoted following worldwide. By night, she meticulously built a case file on the Bracewells, particularly Elijah, whose rise to power had been meteoric following his brother's disappearance. She hired private investigators, carefully chosen for their discretion and lack of connections to the Bracewell empire. She cultivated sources within Bracewell Industries, disgruntled employees, overlooked executives, anyone who might have seen something unusual around the time Michael vanished. Little by little, she accumulated oddities. A maintenance worker who recalled Elijah making unusual calls from the company jet hangar the week before Michael's flight. A financial analyst who'd been fired after questioning certain transfers between Bracewell subsidiaries. A former pilot who claimed the weather conditions on the day of Michael's disappearance weren't as treacherous as reported. None of it constituted proof, but together the fragments painted a disturbing picture. On the 3rd anniversary of the disappearance, Kismet received an unmarked envelope at her office. Inside was a single photograph, Michael's company ID badge, lying on what appeared to be a concrete floor. The image was dated 2 months after his plane had allegedly crashed. Her hands shaking, she immediately called her primary investigator, a former FBI agent named Harmon. "This could be doctored," he cautioned after examining the photo, "or planted to throw you off track. Or it could be real," Kismet countered, "the first concrete evidence that Michael survived the crash." "If he survived, why hasn't he contacted you?" Harmon asked gently. 3 years is a long time, Ms. Kaylani." "Maybe he can't," she insisted. "Maybe he's being held somewhere." Harmon's silence spoke volumes. "I know how it sounds," she acknowledged, "but I know Michael. He's alive, and someone wants me to know it." The photo became the centerpiece of her private investigation, though she told no one else about it, not even Detective Reynolds. Some instinct warned her to keep this potential evidence close. That same instinct had her installing additional security in her penthouse apartment and hiring a personal bodyguard, measures that proved prescient when her office was broken into 3 weeks later. Nothing was stolen, but her files had clearly been searched. The message was clear. Someone was watching her investigation as closely as she was watching them. 5 years after Michael's disappearance, Kismet stood at the window of her office, gazing at the Manhattan skyline she once admired with him. At 35, she was at the height of her power and influence. Kaylani Beauty had expanded globally, its commitment to ethical sourcing and inclusive formulations making it an industry leader. Fashion magazines regularly featured her on their covers, celebrating her business acumen and resilience. To the world, she appeared to have moved forward, the tragic fiancé who had channeled her grief into spectacular success. Only those closest to her knew the truth, that she still wore her engagement ring on a chain beneath her clothes, that she maintained a dedicated team of investigators, that she kept a go-bag packed at all times in case a lead needed immediate pursuit. Her assistant knocked softly before entering with the day's mail. "The usual stack of partnership proposals," she said, placing them on the desk. "And this came by courier. No sender information." The small package was wrapped in plain brown paper. Kismet waited until she was alone before carefully opening it. Inside was a flash drive and a note written in block letters. Not everyone at Bracewell is loyal to Elijah. With trembling fingers, she inserted the drive into her computer. It contained dozens of files, emails, financial records, travel documents, all connected to Elijah Bracewell. Most were mundane business communications, but scattered throughout were references to something called Project Phoenix, dating back to just before Michael's disappearance. One document made her breath catch: a payment of exactly $5 million from a Bracewell shell company to an entity called Lazarus Solutions, 3 days before Michael's plane went missing. The same amount that had appeared in the offshore account under her name. She was still analyzing the files when her private line rang, a number only 5 people had access to. "Ms. Kailani?" The voice was male, unfamiliar, and tense. "Don't say my name, I'm the one who sent you the drive." "Why now?" she asked, immediately alert. "After 5 years?" "Because Elijah is getting careless. He thinks he's untouchable." A pause. "And because I worked with Michael. He deserved better. Is he alive?" The question burst from her before she could stop herself. Another pause, longer this time. "I don't know for certain, but there were arrangements made for transporting a package to a facility in Eastern Europe shortly after the plane incident, a facility that Bracewell officially has no connection to." Kismet's hand tightened on the phone. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Elijah is expanding the company through increasingly questionable means. Those of us who remember how Michael ran things, we're concerned." His voice dropped further. "Look into Lazarus Solutions. It's a private military contractor that specializes in extraction and containment." "Kidnapping," Kismet translated flatly. "Among other services," the caller confirmed. "I have to go. I've risked enough." "Wait," but the line was already dead. Kismet sat motionless for several minutes, the implications washing over her. Then, with renewed purpose, she picked up her secure phone and dialed Harmon. "I need everything on Lazarus Solutions," she said without preamble. "And I need you to prepare for a trip to Eastern Europe. We finally have a lead." For the first time in 5 years, she felt something beyond determination, beyond the grim resolve that had sustained her through the darkness. She felt hope. Chapter 5. Aftermath. 5 years after Michael's disappearance, New York's elite gathered at the Metropolitan Museum for the annual Bracewell Foundation Gala, the same event where Michael had proposed half a decade earlier. Elijah Bracewell stood center stage, accepting congratulations for doubling the foundation's endowment under his leadership. At 38, he had transformed from the resentful younger brother into a force in his own right. Bracewell Industries had expanded aggressively under his direction, acquiring competitors at a pace that raised eyebrows among industry watchdogs, but impressed Wall Street. Across the room, Eleanor Bracewell observed her remaining son. At 70, she remained striking despite the cane she now required. The years had clearly taken their toll, though few would suggest grief for her eldest son was the cause. "You're troubled tonight, Eleanor," noted her oldest friend, Victoria Sheffield. "Simply tired," Eleanor replied with practiced deflection. "These events grow more taxing each year." Victoria wasn't fooled. "It's not just the event, it's him." She nodded toward Elijah. "He's not Michael." Before Eleanor could respond, a murmur swept through the gathering. Heads turned toward the entrance, conversations halting abruptly. Kismet Kailani stood in the doorway, a vision in emerald silk that mirrored the dress she'd worn the night of her engagement. 5 years had only enhanced her beauty, adding gravitas to her features and steely confidence to her bearing. This was her first appearance at a Bracewell event since Michael's memorial service. Eleanor's face shifted from shock to outrage. How dare she? Across the room, Elijah froze mid-conversation, his expression unreadable as he watched Kismet glide into the room. She moved with deliberate grace, acknowledging those brave enough to greet her, ignoring the whispers that followed. Their eyes met across the crowd, predators recognizing each other in a field of prey. Elijah recovered first, smoothly excusing himself to intercept her. "Ms. Kailani," he greeted her, voice pitched to carry. "This is unexpected, is it?" Kismet's smile was razor-sharp. "My invitation arrives faithfully each year. This time I decided to accept. Out of nostalgia, perhaps." His gaze flicked to her hand where Michael's ring would have been, had she not taken to wearing it, concealed around her neck. "Out of curiosity," she corrected. "I wanted to see what you've made of your brother's legacy." Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. "I've simply built upon the foundation Michael laid. He always had vision, but sometimes lacked follow-through." Eleanor materialized at her son's side. "I believe you've made your point by coming here, Ms. Kailani." Kismet turned to her almost mother-in-law with cool assessment. "Eleanor, you're looking well, considering. What is that supposed to mean? Only that carrying secrets must be exhausting at your age." Kismet's gaze drifted past them to the terrace doors, where she and Michael had stepped through on that fateful night. "I wonder if the views are still as beautiful." Without waiting for a response, she moved toward the terrace. Whispers followed. "Shameless. After what she did. Still beautiful, though." Outside in the cool night air, Kismet took a moment to compose herself as memories washed over her. "A dramatic entrance," came a voice from the shadows. "Though I shouldn't be surprised. You always had a flair for theatrics." She turned to find Detective Reynolds leaning against the balustrade. "I wasn't expecting to see you here, Detective," Kismet remarked. "Are you working security now?" Reynolds smiled thinly. "I'm here unofficially, keeping an eye on certain parties." "The Bracewells, you mean?" "Among others." Reynolds moved closer, lowering her voice. "Your trip to Eastern Europe last month, did it yield anything useful?" Kismet's eyes widened fractionally. "How did you—" "I may be off the official investigation, but that doesn't mean I stopped investigating. The facility you visited, it was emptied 3 years ago. Whatever was there is long gone." "Someone was held there," Kismet said quietly. "The caretaker confirmed it. A foreign man kept in isolation. He didn't have a name, but the timeline fits. If it was Michael, where is he now?" Kismet turned back to the view. "That's what I intend to find out. And coming here tonight, watching Elijah's reaction, it confirms he's hiding something." Reynolds studied her with professional assessment. "Be careful. You're playing a dangerous game." "It's not a game to me, it's my life, and possibly Michael's." Inside, the orchestra began a waltz, the same one that had played when Michael proposed. The familiar strains floated through the open doors. "I should go," Reynolds said. "But Kismet, watch yourself tonight. You've stirred the hornet's nest." After the detective disappeared, Kismet remained on the terrace, allowing the memories to wash over her. The weight of 5 years without Michael pressed on her chest, but underneath was a new sensation, the quickening pulse of a hunter closing in on prey. She had chosen this dress, this event, deliberately. A message to the Bracewells. "I know, and I'm coming for you." When she finally re-entered the ballroom, Eleanor had vanished, but Elijah watched her with naked calculation. She raised her glass in a mocking toast before turning to leave, her message delivered. In the elevator descending to the lobby, she removed a small device from her clutch, a specialized phone her security team had provided. On it was a text from Harmon. "Package delivered to EB's office. Waiting for reaction." The package was a duplicate of Michael's ID badge, the one from the mysterious photo, placed where Elijah would find it. A test to see how he would respond to evidence that his brother might have survived. Kismet smiled as the elevator doors opened. The real game was just beginning. The anonymous notes began a week after the gala. The first arrived at her office, slipped beneath the door. "He still dreams of you." The second appeared on her car windshield. "The emerald reminds him of your eyes." The third was delivered with her morning coffee. "Lazarus rises." Each note sent her security team into overdrive, checking surveillance footage, questioning witnesses, scanning for threats. But Kismet understood these weren't threats. They were breadcrumbs. After the seventh note, 10 years is too long, arrived pinned to her dry cleaning, she called a meeting with her inner circle. Harmon, her head of security, and 2 trusted employees who had stood by her through the worst of the accusations. "Someone's trying to tell me Michael is alive," she said without preamble. "And they're getting bolder." Harmon frowned. "Or someone's manipulating you. The Bracewells know you've been investigating. This could be an elaborate trap." "I've considered that," she acknowledged. "But the notes contain details only Michael would know. The emerald reference. When he proposed, he said it reminded him of my eyes in certain light. That wasn't public knowledge. Elijah could have heard it from Michael before his disappearance," her security chief pointed out. "Maybe." She laid out the notes in sequence. "But look at the pattern. They're escalating, becoming more specific. 10 years is too long. That's the anniversary coming up in 2 months. "What are you suggesting?" Harmon asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. "I think whoever is sending these is building to something. A revelation, possibly a reunion." Her team exchanged concerned glances. "Kismet," Harmon said gently, "we need to consider the possibility that your hope is clouding your judgment, even if Michael initially survived the crash after 10 years. "I know what you all think," she interrupted, "that I'm delusional, that I can't accept he's gone. But the evidence is circumstantial at best," her security chief finished. "We found suggestions of wrongdoing by Elijah, yes, connections to Lazarus solutions, unusual financial movements, but nothing that definitively proves Michael survived." Kismet stood, her decision made. "Then we need to force the issue. No more reacting to breadcrumbs. It's time to set our own trap." Over the next weeks, she deliberately increased her visibility, giving interviews about the upcoming 10th anniversary of Michael's disappearance, publicly questioning the closed investigation, hinting at evidence of foul play. She knew the Bracewells would be watching, measuring her knowledge, assessing the threat she posed. And all the while, the notes continued, growing more urgent. Memory returns in fragments. "He knows what they did. Watch your back. A suspects." The last one chilled her. If the notes were truly from someone helping Michael, then Elijah was aware of their communication. 2 weeks before the 10th anniversary, Kismet received a final note, delivered by courier to her penthouse. 10 years of darkness ends tomorrow. Be alone at home, 11 p.m. Trust no one until then. Attached was a small, tattered piece of fabric from the tie Michael had worn the last day she saw him, a tie never recovered from the crash site. With shaking hands, she called Harmon. "I need you to pull all security from my penthouse tomorrow night," she instructed. "Just for an hour, 11 p.m. to midnight." His protest was immediate. "Absolutely not. That's suicide, especially after these escalating messages." "I need to do this," she insisted. "I'll keep a panic button on me. Station your people in the building, but not on my floor. Please, Harmon, if there's even a chance." Finally, he agreed, though reluctantly. 1 hour. After 10 years, I'm asking for 1 hour of trust. Kismet spent the next 24 hours in a state of controlled chaos, cycling through belief and doubt, hope and fear. She dismissed her staff early, checked the panic button repeatedly, and changed outfits 3 times before settling on a simple emerald silk blouse, an echo of what she'd worn that last morning with Michael. At 10:55 p.m., she positioned herself in the living room with clear sight lines to both the elevator and stairwell entrances. Her heart pounded so loudly, she was certain it would be audible to whoever arrived. At precisely 11 o'clock, the security panel beside her elevator chimed, indicating an override. Someone had accessed her private floor without using standard protocols. The elevator doors slid open. The figure that stepped out was a silhouette, backlit by the elevator's interior light. Taller than she remembered, leaner but unmistakable even after a decade. Michael Bracewell stood before her, alive. His face bore a scar running from temple to jaw. His once dark hair was shot through with gray at the temples. But his eyes, those were unchanged, the same gray depths she had fallen into a lifetime ago. "Kismet," he said, his voice rougher than she remembered. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't trust her own eyes. "Is it really you?" she whispered. He stepped forward into the light, letting her see the full reality of him, the new lines around his eyes, the way he favored his right leg slightly, the tremor in his left hand. "It's me," he confirmed. "What's left of me." The distance between them was unbearable. With a sound somewhere between a sob and his name, Kismet closed the gap, her hands reaching to touch his face, confirming his solidity, his warmth, his reality. His arms came around her with desperate strength, pulling her against him as if he might vanish if he didn't hold tightly enough. His face buried in her hair, breathing her in. 10 years, he murmured against her neck. "Every day I fought to come back to you." They sank to the floor together, still entwined, the strength gone from both their legs. Questions could wait. Explanations would come. For now, there was only the miracle of reunion, the circle of their arms, and the shuddering breaths of two souls finding home after a decade of separation. Outside the penthouse windows, the New York skyline glittered unchanged, witness to their reunion as it had been to their parting. Inside, time had collapsed, erasing the decade of longing in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Michael was home, and nothing would tear them apart again. Chapter 6: Clues in the Shadows. The morning after Michael's return, Kismet summoned Harmon to her penthouse, swearing him to absolute secrecy before revealing the miracle that had occurred. 10 years, Harmon whispered, staring at Michael as if seeing a ghost. "We searched everywhere." "Not everywhere," Michael replied grimly. "Elijah was thorough about keeping me hidden." Harmon's professional composure quickly reasserted itself. "This changes our strategy completely. The evidence we've gathered against your brother suddenly has context." Kismet spread her investigative files across the dining table, a decade of determined pursuit transformed overnight from a search into ammunition. "We need to move quickly. Once Elijah discovers Michael is alive and with me, he'll destroy evidence, silence witnesses." "He already knows," Michael said quietly. "The man who helped me escape. He warned me that Elijah has surveillance on you, has had for years." This revelation sent Harmon into immediate action, sweeping the penthouse for bugs while Kismet and Michael retreated to the bathroom, the one room Harmon had confirmed was clean. "We need to get you somewhere secure," Kismet insisted, gripping Michael's hands. "Somewhere Elijah can't reach you while we build our case." Michael shook his head, steel in his gaze. "I've been hidden away for 10 years. I won't spend another day in the shadows." His scarred face hardened with resolve. "Besides, I'm more useful helping connect the evidence you've gathered to what I experienced." Harmon discovered 3 listening devices in the penthouse, professional grade, recently installed. "They weren't here during our last sweep 2 weeks ago," he confirmed. "Elijah must have escalated surveillance after the notes started arriving." This only strengthened Kismet's determination. "Then we use it against him. feed false information while we investigate privately. They developed a system, written communication only for sensitive information, secure phones provided by Harmon for necessary calls, regular sweeps for new surveillance. Michael would remain hidden from public view while they investigated, his existence a secret weapon Elijah wouldn't see coming. Their first breakthrough came from Detective Reynolds, who had maintained contact with Kismet throughout the years. When presented with Michael, alive and bearing the physical evidence of his ordeal, her professional skepticism gave way to determined alliance. "The offshore account used to frame you," she told Kismet, spreading banking documents across the secure hotel room they'd established as their base of operations. "I traced it through 6 shells before hitting a wall. But with the new information Michael provided about Lazarus Solutions, I found the connection. The documents showed a complex web of financial transactions, all ultimately leading back to subsidiary companies controlled by Elijah Bracewell. He laundered the money," Reynolds explained. "$5 million to Lazarus for the abduction, then the same amount transferred to the account in your name as a false trail." "Can we prove it?" Michael asked, studying the documents with the intensity that had once made him a formidable CEO. "Not conclusively. Not yet." Reynolds hesitated. "But I have a contact at the Financial Crimes Unit. With your permission, I'd like to bring him in." Kismet and Michael exchanged glances, silently weighing the risk of expanding their circle against the need for official authority. "Do it," Michael decided. "The more legal weight we have behind us, the harder it will be for Elijah to wriggle free." Over the following weeks, their investigation accelerated. Michael's knowledge of Bracewell Industries' internal structure provided access points Kismet's team had never discovered. His testimony about the facilities where he'd been held led them to Eastern Europe once more, this time with specific locations to investigate. In a remote area of Romania, they found the facility where Michael had been kept during his final years of captivity. The building stood abandoned now, but evidence remained. Medical supplies matching the drugs Michael had been given, restraints in a room matching his description, employment records for guards whose faces he recognized from photographs. Most damning was a payment ledger discovered hidden in the facility manager's former office, detailing monthly transfers from Phoenix Initiative, the project name Elijah had used in his confidential communications. "This connects everything," Harmon said, carefully photographing each page. "The facility, the payments, the timeline of Michael's captivity." But the true breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Eleanor Bracewell, now declining in health, requested a private meeting with Kismet, something unprecedented in their decade-long Cold War. "You should not go," Michael insisted when Kismet received the message. "It could be a trap." "Or she could know something crucial," Kismet countered. "She's been by Elijah's side through everything. If anyone knows the full extent of his actions, it's your mother." In the end, they compromised. Kismet would meet Eleanor at her Hamptons estate, but with Harmon and Reynolds positioned nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. Eleanor received her in Julian Bracewell's old library, frail now but still regal in her bearing. "You've been investigating my family for a decade," she said without preamble. "I want to know what you've found." "Why now?" Kismet asked, refusing to reveal her hand prematurely. "Because I'm dying," Eleanor replied simply. "Cancer, 6 months at most, according to my doctors. And I find myself reconsidering certain choices." Kismet studied the woman who had once tried to destroy her, searching for deception and finding only exhaustion. "You know what Elijah did." It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. "Not at first. He told me Michael died in the crash, that the investigation implicating you was legitimate." Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a leather portfolio beside her chair. "I believed him because it was easier than questioning, than facing the alternative." "When did you learn the truth?" 3 years ago. I overheard a phone call. Elijah discussing contingency plans if the asset ever escaped. Eleanor's eyes, so like Michael's, filled with tears that refused to fall. I confronted him. He claimed it was for Michael's protection, that he'd suffered brain damage in the crash and needed specialized care. "You chose to believe that," Kismet said, unable to keep the accusation from her voice. "I chose what I could live with," Eleanor corrected sharply. "But recently, I found this while looking for my will in Elijah's office." She pushed the portfolio across the table. "If what I suspect is true, I cannot take it to my grave." Inside were documents detailing the original plan, not just Michael's abduction, but the systematic campaign to discredit Kismet afterward. Eleanor's signature appeared nowhere, but the timeline, the detailed strategy for turning public opinion against the gold digger, could only have been created with her knowledge. Most shocking was a handwritten note in Elijah's writing, dated just before Michael's disappearance. "Mother agrees M has become a liability to the family. She prefers not to know details of containment solution." Kismet looked up from the damning evidence, meeting Eleanor's gaze with cold fury. "You gave him permission." "Not for imprisonment," Eleanor whispered, the first tears finally escaping. "I thought a payoff, perhaps. Something to separate you from Michael. I never imagined Elijah would what? Arrange his brother's kidnapping? Fake his death? Hold him prisoner for 10 years? Kismet's voice rose despite her efforts at control. "What did you think containment meant?" Eleanor had no answer, her silence more damning than any justification. "Why give me this now?" Kismet demanded, securing the portfolio in her bag. "Because I saw your investigator at the Eastern European facility," Eleanor admitted. "One of Elijah's security people reported your activities. When I confronted Elijah again, his explanation changed. He claimed Michael had threatened the company, was mentally unstable." She looked away. The lies became too elaborate, too contradictory. "And you want redemption," Kismet concluded coldly. "Absolution before you die." "I want justice," Eleanor corrected. "For my son, whatever that means for Elijah. Or for me." Kismet's eyes narrowed. "How much did you actually know from the beginning, Eleanor? These documents suggest your involvement was peripheral, but I find that hard to believe." Eleanor's gaze dropped momentarily. "I knew more than I'm admitting in these documents. I approved the initial plan to separate you from Michael, though I truly didn't understand the full extent of what Elijah intended." A calculated omission, Kismet realized, designed to minimize Eleanor's culpability while still appearing forthcoming. Kismet stood, gathering her composure. "Justice is coming, Eleanor, but not absolution. Not for what was done to Michael." She paused at the door. "He loved you, you know. Despite everything, he defended you to me. Said you were a product of your time, your position." Eleanor's face crumpled for an instant before she recovered her dignity. "Will you tell him I'm dying?" "I'll tell him everything," Kismet promised, letting the ambiguity hang between them as she left. In the car, she carefully examined the portfolio Eleanor had provided. The documents appeared genuine, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor was still hiding aspects of her involvement, offering just enough truth to appear forthcoming while protecting herself. She would need forensic analysis to verify everything before presenting it to Michael, whose emotional stability remained fragile when it came to his family's betrayal. When she returned to their secure location, Michael was waiting, tension visible in every line of his body. What did she want? Kismet placed the portfolio on the table between them. "To confess, and to give us the final piece we need to destroy Elijah." As Michael read through the documents, his expression shifted from shock to grief to cold rage. "She knew," he whispered. "Maybe not everything, but enough." "Yes," Kismet confirmed gently. "And she's dying. Cancer." Michael absorbed this with complex emotion crossing his scarred face. All this time, I blamed only Elijah, believed she was deceived along with everyone else. He looked up, eyes haunted. What else have I been wrong about? Kismet moved to his side, her hand finding his. We'll find all the answers, Michael, and then we'll make them pay. Every last person involved in taking you from me. Together, they turned to the evidence spread before them, the fragments of a decade-long conspiracy finally forming a complete picture, revealing not just Elijah's betrayal, but a wider network of accomplices, enablers, and willing participants in the destruction of 2 lives. The path forward was clear now. With Eleanor's documents, Reynolds' financial trail, the evidence from the Romanian facility, and Michael's testimony, they had everything needed to bring Elijah to justice. It's time, Michael said, resolution hardening his features. No more hiding. No more investigating from the shadows. Kismet nodded, her hand tightening around his. Time to bring everything into the light. Chapter 7. The Reunion. The night Michael appeared at Kismet's door changed everything. 10 years of longing collapsed into a single moment of recognition, a heartbeat of disbelief before reality reasserted itself. Michael, she whispered, his name both prayer and confirmation, as he stepped from the elevator into the soft light of her penthouse. He stood before her, transformed by a decade of captivity. The scar running down the left side of his face was only the most visible change. His once powerful frame had grown leaner, harder, stripped of everything but essential strength. Silver threaded his dark hair at the temples, and his eyes, those familiar gray eyes, held shadows that hadn't existed before. Kismet, he said, her name rough in his throat, as if he'd spent years avoiding speaking it aloud. For an endless moment, neither moved, afraid the mirage would shatter. Then Kismet stepped forward, her hand reaching tentatively to touch his face, fingers tracing the unfamiliar scar. "Is it really you?" she asked, voice breaking. "It's me," he confirmed, his own hand rising to cover hers, pressing it against his cheek. "What's left of me?" The contact broke something in both of them. With a sound that was half sob, half his name, Kismet threw herself into his arms. Michael caught her with desperate strength, burying his face in her hair, breathing her in as if starved for her scent. They clung together, the solid warmth of reconnection washing away a decade of separation in cascading waves of emotion. Words seemed inadequate, irrelevant in the face of this miracle, this impossible return. When their lips finally met, it was with the fierce hunger of drowning people finding air. Years of longing translated into touch, into breathless kisses that tasted of salt, tears neither could contain. Later, much later, they lay tangled in her bed, reluctant to break contact, even to speak. Michael's fingers traced patterns on her bare shoulder, relearning the texture of her skin, while Kismet studied the map of new scars across his body, evidence of his ordeal written in flesh. "I thought you were dead," she whispered into the darkness. "They made me believe it, but something in me never accepted it." "They told me you had killed yourself," he replied, voice hollow with remembered pain. "After being accused of arranging my disappearance. They showed me newspaper clippings, doctored, I realize now." Kismet propped herself on one elbow, studying his face in the dim light. "How did you survive it?" "Believing I was gone." Michael's eyes closed briefly, his expression revealing the cost of remembering. "I didn't, not really. I existed. I endured. But part of me died with you." She pressed her lips to the scar on his face, this physical reminder of his suffering. "When did you learn I was alive?" 6 months ago, after I escaped." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining as if afraid to lose contact. "I made it to a village near the facility, stole clothes, money. Found my way to an internet cafe. I searched your name, expecting to find old obituaries. and found my company instead, Kismet finished, understanding dawning. My face on magazine covers. He nodded, swallowing hard. I thought I was hallucinating, that the drugs were still in my system, creating visions of what I wanted most. His grip tightened. I spent 3 days hiding in that village, obsessively reading everything I could find about you online, convincing myself you were real, alive. Why didn't you come to me then? The question held no accusation, only need to understand. Because Elijah still had power, resources. I needed to know what I was facing before I risked your safety. Michael's expression hardened. And I needed to remember who I was. After years being drugged, controlled, I wasn't stable. Kismet traced the line of his jaw, now sharper than she remembered. You were protecting me. Always, he whispered fiercely. Even when I had nothing else left, I had that purpose. She kissed him then, a silent acknowledgement of his sacrifice, his endurance. When they separated, she asked the question that had burned within her since his appearance. How did they do it? Your disappearance? Michael shifted to sit against the headboard, drawing her against his chest as if the physical connection made the telling possible. The company pilot was bribed. Once we were airborne, he offered me a drink. It was drugged. His voice became clinical, detached, a survival mechanism for revisiting trauma. I woke in a concrete room, disoriented. Men in uniform told me there had been an attempt on my life, that I was in protective custody while the threat was investigated. You believed them? At first, they showed me news reports about my plane crashing, explained it was a necessary cover while they investigated who wanted me dead. His laugh was hollow. They kept me drugged enough to be compliant, confused about time. I realize now it was a carefully calibrated cocktail, enough awareness to function, not enough to fight effectively. Kismet listened in horror as he described the facilities where he'd been held, first in a remote location in the American Southwest, later moved internationally as Elijah grew more confident in his control of Bracewell Industries. The Romanian facility was the final one, Michael explained. By then, Elijah had cut costs, reduced security. The dosage of my medication became less consistent. My mind started to clear for the first time in years. And you planned your escape, Kismet finished. He nodded, his expression showing grim satisfaction. I spent months regaining strength, observing patterns. When they transferred me between buildings, I overpowered a guard, took his credentials, made it outside the compound before alarms sounded. The clinical detachment in his voice broke as he continued, emotion bleeding through. I kept thinking of you. Even believing you were gone, you were what drove me. The need to know the truth, to make Elijah pay for both our lives. Kismet held him tighter, as if her embrace could retrospectively protect him from those years of isolation and pain. And now, you're here. With me. With you, he echoed, wonder in his voice. After believing for so long it was impossible. They fell silent, the magnitude of their reunion settling around them like a physical presence. Outside, dawn began to lighten the sky, the first tentative rays illuminating two people who had found their way back to each other across an impossible gulf of separation. What happens now? Kismet finally asked, reality intruding on their cocoon of reconnection. Michael's expression hardened with resolve. Now we bring Elijah to justice for everything he took from us, for the decade he stole. It won't be easy, she warned. He's powerful now, more than when you knew him. Well-connected, protected. So are we, Michael countered, a flash of his old confidence emerging. You've built your own empire while I was gone, and we have truth on our side. Kismet smiled, recognizing the strategic thinker who had once commanded boardrooms. We also have evidence. I've been investigating your disappearance for 10 years, gathering fragments that now make sense with your testimony. They spent the morning outlining their approach, comparing knowledge, building the foundation for Elijah's downfall. As they worked, Kismet marveled at Michael's resilience, the core of him unchanged despite everything he'd endured. His mind remained sharp, his determination unbroken. When exhaustion finally claimed them, they slept tangled together, unwilling to lose contact even in unconsciousness. Their bodies remembered what their minds still struggled to accept, that the impossible had happened, that fate had granted them a second chance. Later, as evening approached, they stood together at the window overlooking Manhattan, the city lighting up as darkness fell. Michael's arms encircled Kismet from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder as they watched the familiar skyline. "I used to dream of this view," he murmured against her ear. "In the worst moments, I would close my eyes and picture you here, looking out over the city we loved." Kismet leaned back into his embrace, savoring his solid warmth. "I never changed the penthouse. Everyone said I should move, start fresh, but I couldn't bear to leave the last place we'd been happy together." His arms tightened around her. 10 years, he whispered, the weight of lost time in his voice. 10 years, she agreed, turning in his embrace to face him. "But we have now, and tomorrow, and all the days after that." "Elijah took a decade from us," Michael said, his expression hardening with resolve. "He doesn't get one day more." In the gathering darkness, they sealed this promise with a kiss that spoke of reclamation, of a future wrestled back from those who had tried to destroy it. Whatever came next, justice, confrontation, the inevitable public shock at Michael's return, they would face it as they stood now, together, unbroken, their hearts beating in unified defiance of those who had tried to keep them apart. Later that night, as Michael slept beside her, Kismet observed the subtle signs of his trauma, the way he positioned himself to see the door, how his hands occasionally twitched as if fighting invisible restraints. She understood his recovery would be a journey measured in years, not days. The physical scars were only the surface of what had been done to him. His psychological healing would require patience, professional support, and unwavering love, all of which she was prepared to provide for as long as necessary. The night deepened around them, but for the first time in 10 years, neither feared the darkness. They had found each other across an impossible void. Nothing could separate them again. Chapter 8. The Conspiracy Unveiled. For 3 weeks following Michael's return, he and Kismet worked methodically to build their case against Elijah. Their investigation headquarters, a secure hotel suite, contained wall-to-wall evidence of the conspiracy, financial records, witness statements, facility documentation. "The financial trail is our strongest evidence," said Thomas Chen, the financial crimes investigator Reynolds had brought in. "Elijah created shell companies to distance himself from Lazarus Solutions, but we've identified matching payment patterns connecting everything back to him." Reynolds nodded. "And we have former Lazarus employees ready to testify about the Romanian facility operations." "What about Eleanor?" Michael asked quietly. Kismet exchanged glances with Reynolds. "The documents she provided implicate her knowledge," Kismet said carefully. "Our forensic analysis confirmed they're authentic." "But they're selective," Reynolds added. "She's provided enough to appear cooperative while minimizing her involvement." Michael examined the email exchanges between Eleanor and Elijah from before his disappearance. The coded language was clear enough. Discussions of containment options and concerns about Michael's reckless choices, threatening the family legacy. "She knew," Michael said flatly. "Maybe not every detail, but she approved the plan." They set a date for execution, 2 weeks out, time enough to finalize their case without risking leaks about Michael's return. But 5 days before their scheduled move, Reynolds arrived unannounced, her expression grave. "We have a problem. A federal judge just granted a warrant to access Bracewell Industries servers based on an anonymous tip about financial irregularities. "That's good news, isn't it?" Kismet asked. "It would be, except the warrant is limited in scope and being executed by agents with no knowledge of our investigation. If they alert Elijah, he'll start covering tracks." "How much time do we have?" Michael asked. "The warrant will be served tomorrow morning." Their carefully crafted timeline collapsed. Hours later, their source inside Bracewell Tower reported security teams accessing archives and removing files, while IT conducted emergency server maintenance. "He knows something's coming," Michael concluded grimly. "There's more," the source added. "Eleanor Bracewell was admitted to the hospital this morning, terminal phase. She's asking for family." The implications were significant. Eleanor's imminent death would draw Elijah to the hospital, a controlled environment with witnesses. "We need to split our resources," Michael decided. "While federal agents execute warrants on Bracewell Tower and his home, I'll appear at the hospital. It's the last place Elijah would expect to see me, with too many witnesses for him to risk anything drastic." "It's too dangerous," Harmon objected. "You'd be exposing yourself before we have him in custody." "No," Reynolds said slowly. "It could work. Elijah would be off balance, shocked, and a hospital has security cameras, staff, visitors, multiple witnesses. They spent 3 hours adapting their plan, coordinating with federal agents. Reynolds would lead the raid on Bracewell Tower with Kismet, who knew which servers contained critical evidence. Harmon would accompany Michael to the hospital with a security detail. Their goodbye was brief but intense. Michael pressed his forehead to Kismet's. "Come back to me," she whispered. "No more separations." "No more separations," he echoed. The hospital corridor was hushed when Michael arrived. Outside Eleanor's private room, relatives gathered in somber clusters. Distant cousins and family connections maintained more for social advantage than affection. At first, no one recognized him. 10 years, the scar, the physical changes, all served as an effective disguise. Michael moved through them like a ghost, watching recognition dawn gradually in widening eyes. "It can't be Michael Bracewell, but he's dead." A nurse stepped forward, blocking his path. "Family only, sir." "I am family," Michael replied, his voice carrying. "I'm her son." The collective intake of breath was audible as he pushed past the stunned nurse into the dimly lit room. Eleanor lay propped against pillows, diminished by illness. Beside her bed, Elijah stood frozen, his back to the door. "Hello, Mother," Michael said quietly. "Hello, brother." Elijah turned slowly, his face draining of color. Fear flashed across his features before corporate training reasserted itself. "Michael," Eleanor whispered, reaching a trembling hand toward him. "You're alive." "No thanks to either of you," he replied, his voice gentle despite the accusation. Elijah recovered quickly. "Michael, what are you saying? We thought you died in the crash. Where have you been all these years?" "You know exactly where I've been. In the facilities you paid Lazarus Solutions to maintain. Drugged, imprisoned, while you took everything that was mine." Eleanor clutched at Michael's arm. "Elijah told me you were dead. The investigators showed us wreckage evidence. And when you learned the truth 3 years ago, when you confronted Elijah about the asset who might escape," her eyes closed briefly in shame. "I wanted to believe his explanations, that you were being protected, that you were damaged, unstable." "Convenient lies," Michael said flatly. Elijah's mind had clearly been working, calculating risks and options. "Whatever you think happened, Michael, you're clearly confused, traumatized. We should discuss this privately." "It's too late for that," Michael interrupted. "As we speak, the FBI is seizing your records, your communications with Lazarus Solutions. The financial trail connecting you to my abduction, is being presented to the Bracewell board right now. Fear flickered across Elijah's face. You can't prove anything. I don't need to. The evidence speaks for itself, and I'm very much alive to testify about what was done to me. Elijah's hand moved toward his jacket pocket. Faster than anyone would have expected, Michael seized his wrist. Too late, brother. Outside the room, a commotion erupted as hospital security confronted Harmon's team. Taking advantage of the distraction, Elijah wrenched free and lunged for the door. He made it 3 steps into the corridor before federal agents appeared, Reynolds at their head. "Elijah Bracewell," she announced, her badge held high. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, fraud, and attempted murder." The family members pressed against the walls, shock rendering them mute as Elijah was handcuffed, his protests ignored as agents escorted him toward the elevator. Michael watched from the doorway, vindication and grief for what his family had become warring within him. Eleanor called him back to her bedside. "Michael," she whispered, "I don't expect forgiveness. But you should know. I kept something for you. Something Elijah doesn't know about." "What?" Michael asked despite himself. "A letter. From your father. Before he died, he suspected Elijah's resentment might become dangerous. He left instructions in the safe behind his portrait in the library. The combination is your birth date." Michael absorbed this revelation with stunned silence. His father, so often distant in life, had perhaps seen more clearly than anyone the darkness growing in his younger son. "I should have listened," Eleanor continued, her voice fading. "Should have opened the letter after you disappeared, but I couldn't bear to face what it might contain." Before Michael could respond, medical alarms sounded, Eleanor's vitals dropping as staff rushed in to stabilize her. In the corridor, Reynolds was waiting. "We got him. And based on initial findings from the raids, several executives will face charges. The evidence Kismet identified was exactly where she said." "And Kismet?" Michael asked, his priority clear despite the chaos. "Safe. She's coordinating with the forensic team at Bracewell Tower. She found something you should know about." "What?" "Footage from the New Mexico facility where you were first held. Elijah kept video records of your condition, visual evidence of what they did to you. The implications settled over him. Irrefutable proof that would make denial impossible." "There's something else," Reynolds continued. "Documents showing Eleanor wasn't just aware of what Elijah did. According to emails, she helped plan it from the beginning. Her signature is on the original contract with Lazarus Solutions." The betrayal, deeper than he had imagined, struck Michael with physical force. He leaned against the wall, processing this final revelation about his dying mother. "Are you all right?" Reynolds asked with concern. "I will be," he promised, straightening, "now that the truth is finally out. All of it." The revelation about Eleanor completed the picture he'd been assembling since his escape. No more shadows, no more questions about who had orchestrated his suffering. The conspiracy was fully exposed, every player identified, every motivation understood. Despite the fresh pain of his mother's deeper betrayal, Michael felt a strange clarity emerging. This completeness meant he could finally face forward without looking back, could rebuild without fear of unknown conspirators still lurking in the shadows. As he left the hospital, reporters were already gathering, word of Michael Bracewell's miraculous return spreading through news channels. The story that had begun with his disappearance a decade ago was entering its final chapter, Chapter 9, Justice and Retribution. The world exploded with the news of Michael Bracewell's miraculous return. Headlines screamed the impossible story, heir returns from the dead, and Bracewell conspiracy exposed. Business networks ran continuous coverage of Elijah's arrest, Financial markets reacted as Bracewell Industries' stock plummeted and social media erupted with the decade-old accusations against Kismet suddenly re-examined in harsh new light. Through it all, Michael and Kismet remained sequestered in her penthouse, protected from the media frenzy by Harmon's security team while they worked with prosecutors to build an airtight case. "The evidence is overwhelming," Reynolds assured them during a briefing 1 week after Elijah's arrest. "Financial records, witness statements, the Romanian facility documentation, and now the video footage from New Mexico. The U.S. attorney is confident of conviction on all counts." "What about my mother?" Michael asked quietly. Reynolds' expression softened with genuine regret. "The evidence of her involvement is substantial, Michael. But given her condition..." She hesitated. "The prosecutors are considering her terminal diagnosis. It's likely she'll be charged but allowed to remain under house arrest given her medical needs." Eleanor Bracewell had survived her crisis at the hospital, returning to the family mansion to live out her final days under the supervision of medical staff and the watchful eyes of federal agents. Michael had not returned to see her, the betrayal too raw, too absolute for reconciliation. "And the board?" Kismet asked, shifting the conversation to Bracewell Industries' future. "What's their position?" "In chaos," Reynolds admitted. "Half want to distance themselves entirely from the Bracewell name, while others are calling for your return, Michael. As the rightful heir, the only Bracewell untainted by the conspiracy." Michael shook his head, the idea clearly unwelcome. "I have no interest in returning to that life. The company can find new leadership, rebuild without me." Later that night, as they lay in the darkness of Kismet's bedroom, she broached the subject again. "Are you certain about Bracewell Industries? It was meant to be your legacy." Michael was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "That legacy was poisoned long before Elijah's betrayal," he finally said. "My father built an empire on exclusion, on old money and older prejudices. Look how they treated you from the beginning." "But you could transform it," she suggested. "Use your position to create something better." "Perhaps." He turned to face her in the darkness. "But first, we need to ensure justice is complete. Not just for Elijah, but for everyone involved in the conspiracy." "The prosecutors have everyone under investigation," Kismet assured him. "The board members who turned a blind eye, the executives who helped Elijah falsify records." "It's not enough," Michael said, resolve hardening his voice. "I want them to face more than legal consequences. I want public accountability." Thus began the final phase of their plan. Not just prosecution, but public reckoning. Michael granted a single television interview, carefully controlled, where he described his captivity in unflinching detail. The footage from New Mexico was released, showing him drugged, restrained, his identity obscured by false medical records, labeling him a dangerous psychiatric patient. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Protests formed outside Bracewell Tower, demands for accountability spreading to every company affiliated with Bracewell Industries. Clients and partners began severing ties, unwilling to be associated with such scandal. In this atmosphere of growing outrage, Michael and Kismet prepared their masterstroke. The annual Bracewell Foundation Gala, the same event where they had become engaged a decade earlier, was approaching. Despite the scandal, the foundation board had voted to proceed, desperate to distance the charitable organization from the corporate conspiracy. "It's the perfect venue," Michael explained as they finalized their plan. "Every power player in New York will be there. Everyone who ever doubted you, who believed the lies about your involvement in my disappearance." Kismet's eyes gleamed with anticipation. "A public vindication." "More than that," he replied, taking her hand. "A reclamation of our story, our truth, and the beginning of something new." The night of the gala arrived, the Metropolitan Museum transformed once again into a showcase of wealth and influence. Security was unprecedented, both because of Michael's high-profile return and the threats that had emerged against Bracewell interests since the scandal broke. Kismet prepared with particular care, selecting an emerald gown that echoed but elevated the one she'd worn to their fateful engagement. When Michael saw her, emotion overcame him momentarily. "You look exactly as I remembered you," he said, voice rough with feeling. "In my darkest moments, this is what I pictured. You in emerald silk, waiting for me to find my way back." She touched the scar on his face gently. "And now you have." They arrived at the gala precisely when the evening's speeches were scheduled to begin. Their entrance created exactly the sensation they had intended. Conversations halting mid-sentence, champagne glasses freezing halfway to lips. The entire gathering struck silent by their appearance. Michael guided Kismet through the crowd with deliberate confidence, nodding to those brave enough to meet his eye, ignoring those who looked away in shame or discomfort. They moved directly to the stage where the Foundation's interim chairman stood frozen in shock at their approach. Without asking permission, Michael took the microphone. "Good evening," he began, his voice carrying through the hushed room. "For those who somehow haven't heard, my name is Michael Bracewell. 10 years ago, I was abducted on the orders of my brother and my mother, held captive while they dismantled my life and slandered the woman I love." The bluntness of his opening sent a visible ripple through the audience. No carefully crafted PR statement, no political phrasing, just stark, uncomfortable truth. "Many of you in this room played a part in what happened," he continued, his gaze sweeping the gathering. "Some actively participated in the conspiracy. Others simply believed the lies about Kismet because they were more comfortable than the truth. You attended my memorial service, expressed condolences to my family, then whispered about the gold digger who had somehow engineered my disappearance." Beside him, Kismet stood tall, her expression regal as she faced the society that had once rejected her. "Tonight isn't about my brother's crimes or my mother's betrayal," Michael declared. "Those will be addressed in court. Tonight is about a different kind of accountability, the social complicity that allowed their conspiracy to succeed." From within his tuxedo jacket, he withdrew a folded document. "This is the guest list from what would have been our wedding, with annotations showing who declined, who spread rumors, who assisted in isolating Kismet after I disappeared." Uncomfortable shifting rippled through the crowd as Michael continued. "Beside it, I have the donor list for Kismet's charity supporting women entrepreneurs of color. Work," she continued even while fighting to clear her name. "The contrast is illuminating." He set both documents aside, his expression softening as he turned to Kismet. "But that's the past. Tonight is also about the future." Taking her hand, he faced the audience once more. "Effective immediately, I am severing all ties with Bracewell Industries and the Bracewell Foundation. The company my family built on exclusion and privilege is not worth saving." Gasps echoed through the ballroom at this announcement, the final repudiation of a dynasty. "Instead," Michael continued, "Kismet and I are establishing a new foundation focused on supporting victims of injustice and corporate malfeasance. It will be funded initially by my personal fortune, which federal courts have recently restored to me, along with substantial damages from Bracewell Industries." He turned to Kismet, his public declaration becoming suddenly intimate. 10 years ago, in this very room, I asked you to marry me. Then that future was stolen from us. Now I'm asking again, not just to be my wife, but my partner in building something better from the ashes of what was destroyed." Kismet's smile was radiant as she took the microphone. "For 10 years, I was labeled a manipulator, a gold digger, a potential murderer. All because I dared to love someone from a world that deemed me unworthy. Her voice carried clear and strong, without a hint of the tears that shimmered in her eyes. To those who believed those lies, who perpetuated them, who took satisfaction in my pain, I don't forgive you. The bluntness of her statement hung in the air, challenging the expectation of gracious reconciliation. But I also don't need your approval anymore, she continued. I built my own empire while fighting to find the truth. And yes, Michael, I will marry you, again and always. We'll create a legacy that helps rather than harms, that includes rather than excludes. As they sealed this promise with a kiss, the room remained stunned into silence, witness to a reckoning none had anticipated. When they turned to leave,